So obviously we're going to have this press conference last week, but events took over, so we wanted to really reschedule this week because this is such great and important news for Albuquerque and for the state of New Mexico. With that, I'm going to have Chief Harold Medina get it started. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. We're going to announce an update to the arrest for an individual for the murder of Althea Oakeley. You know, when I was about 14, 15 years old, I remember Althea going over to the house. My mom made fiesta skirts for fiesta candidates, and I remember over the course of the summer she went several times. And I always remember that, you know, she had a really good personality. She walked in, she was very friendly. She was bubbly in the way she said hi to everybody in the house. And, you know, over the years I saw several Queen candidates go to the house, and without a doubt, you know, I could say that she was one of the nicest people that ever went over. And it was very disappointing a couple of years later and saddening to not just us in the household for getting to meet her over that time, but for the community to learn that somebody who had left, you know, the small town of Taos and came to the University of New Mexico had been murdered. And it was a lot of individuals who were sad. I remember getting home and my mom herself was crying in the kitchen saying, you know, Althea had died. And she had developed, you know, that sense of a bond with her over the summer as she made outfits. You know, the kind of case laid there, and it went unsolved for a period of time. And, you know, a couple years later, I was lucky enough to get a memorial scholarship from the family. And we think it was the first, it could have been the second. You know, there is 1989 a possibility, but in 1990 I received a memorial scholarship from the family to help me go to college. And I've talked about it many times that, you know, I was a first generation college graduate, and back then every penny helped. And it did assist me in getting an education. And I went to college and eventually joined APD. And in around 2013-14 timeframe, when I was a commander, I had reached out to the cold case unit and I asked them, hey, can we revisit this case and see if there's something that got overseen? I knew that over time DNA had advanced. Somebody could enter the system and there's a print that hadn't been ran. I was just hoping that something was there that they could try to solve this case. And unfortunately, the detective at the time came back and told me, Commander, there's nothing in there that we could move on right now, and there's no leads. Again, I retired in 2014. I went away, and that case always stood out in my mind. When I returned in 2017, you know, it was in December, and during 2018 and 19, the case was looked at a couple times again, as I had asked if there was anything new in there. They had a little bit of information, but it was nothing that they could move forward on. And once again, the case was closed, and we had no further information. You know, and then a couple weeks ago, we were approached, and Violent Crimes advised me that they had a suspect in a number of homicides and violent crime acts, and they were trying to find the cases, and that the case that they had the strongest was the first, and they mentioned that it was the homicide of a female outside of the university area in the late 1980s. I immediately told Deputy Chief Commander Hartsock, you know, have you looked at the Althea Oakeley case? And he came back and he told me, Chief, that is the exact case, that is our strongest case. So I advised him at the time that when it came time to notifications, that if he would let me know, I would like to travel to Taos myself to personally tell the family that this case had been solved and somebody had been charged. You know, and then fast forward, you know, we had a series of incidents the week before, and on Sunday, they told me that they were going to get ready to charge this case on Wednesday. So Monday morning, myself, Gilbert Gallegos, and Kyle, we spoke, and we made the decision that we would leave to Taos somewhere around 2, 3 o'clock. Sometime that afternoon, they were looking for me for counsel, and I was trying to balance it not getting out of the bag that we were up in Taos making a notification, but at the same time, I'm trying to answer that, you know, I'm not there, and I had to answer some questions at council. You know, when we arrived there in Taos, you know, Mr. Oakeley was a pillar of the community. He owned an insurance agency, and a lot of individuals knew him. And his wife met us in the driveway, and I reminded her who I was, and she didn't realize that, you you know, that I had become chief of police. And as I spoke to her, you know, her husband came out, and when he realized who I was, he had asked me how my parents were, and we had a brief conversation. And we had called them before we had driven up there, and they later told us that they thought we were on our way to tell them that the case would permanently be closed forever and that it wasn't going to be solved. When I told them that we had identified somebody that they had come forward and they had admitted, and we were verifying information, and that pending charges were coming, initially we were going to charge that case on last Wednesday. As we were talking with the family, we discovered that Thursday was actually Althea's birthday, so I asked Violent Crimes to move the charging to Thursday, which we didn't get to have our press conference to announce this because it was her birthday. And in a way, that was a gift from the Albuquerque Police Department to her on her birthday, that somebody who killed her 33 years later was charged. Our cold case detectives have been working diligently since getting confessions and information this person had committed these crimes. And I want to personally thank the University of New Mexico, police department, because they could have sat on this information, but they didn't. They immediately began working with us, getting this information back out to us, which was vital for us to be able to move forward on this investigation. They worked with the district attorney's office, and charges against Paul Apodaca, a convicted felon, came forward last Thursday in the murder of Althea Oakeley. Apodaca has a violent criminal history in Albuquerque, and in addition to the crimes he has been convicted of, his confession to killing Althea Oakeley, Apodaca has also confessed to one additional shooting and murders, including the homicide of 18-year-old Kaitlyn Arquette in 1989. The Arquette case is one of the most infamous cold cases in Albuquerque history because of her mother's high-profile books about the murder. I can't speak for the facts of the investigation in 1989, but I want to be sure detectives are investigating every single aspect, verifying every piece of evidence, and ensuring that we have a strong case before we move forward on charges on the Arquette case. Apodaca has also confessed to committing 3 rapes during that time period. Our sex crime unit is reviewing those cases, but we can confirm that one of those rapes is connected to Apodaca. In closing, I'd like to thank the detectives of the Albuquerque Police Department for working so hard to bring justice to these families 33 years later. I also want to send a message to all the families out there of cold case murder victims that we will not stop looking at these cases. We're actually working on some changes within our cold case unit, and things will be rolling out in the near future as what we've been doing to ensure that we continue to work on these cases to try to bring justice to families. I also want to thank Mayor Keller for the opportunity to be chief of police. I don't think that, 31 years ago when that memorial scholarship was given, that they thought that that individual they gave that small amount of money to would end up being the chief of police of the Albuquerque Police Department. We'll continue to fight crime every day and ensure that we do everything we can to bring people to custody and keep the community safe. And in closing, over the course of the last 5 days, I've gotten numerous messages from friends, families, classmates of Mrs. Oakeley from Taos. For the people back home, I just want to say thank you for all the support, and I'm glad that the Albuquerque Police Department was able to bring a level of closure to a community that 31 years ago was rocked when this occurred, and over the past 5 days, and the amount of individuals who have reached out to me clearly shows how there was still unanswered questions for friends, family, and relatives of Mrs. Oakeley. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the mayor. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Chief, first and foremost, for your dedication to this and your quick thinking, putting different pieces of information together to actually bring some justice, albeit 33 years later. I think for us, this is a powerful example, though, of the kind of results that you can have, even if it takes this long, when we've got a good leadership in place and we also understand the deep history that is interwoven in our communities throughout New Mexico. A lot of times people talk about whether it's APD or Albuquerque's situation. These issues often affect our entire state, and the connection here between the chief's own family background growing up in Taos and obviously his connection to the victim and their family is something that spans our entire state. Now, I also want to mention that today is, I think it's so important that we acknowledge the actual slice of justice that we're talking about here today, not just for the families and for the victims and the community of Taos, but also for our officers who never give up on cold cases. Cold cases is just a term for, in the long run, needs a lot more information and leads. And so I want to also thank the detectives, the officers who've been involved in this over the course of the last 33 years for not giving up. That is so important, and this should be a strong reminder that our police department does not give up on cold cases. And also, APD doesn't give up on trying to bring justice for our community. And I know this also represents some personal justice for every officer along the way, every detective who spent time trying to work on this case. They now can also have a sense of justice. Now, I also want to mention, is the chief mentioned that the offender has confessed to the raping of women in the past, and we're going through exactly where all that's going to lead. But we know that it's very unfortunate, but historically we were not able to connect Paul Apodaca to different types of victims. And this is one thing that we want to highlight, because a key piece of this was our work clearing the rape kit backlog and also the utilization of DNA evidence through the CODIS database. So it was a little bit of a coincidence of timing, but our sex crime unit got a CODIS hit on one of those actual sexual assault kits that had been tested. And the DNA from this kit matched the DNA of Paul Apodaca. So this is yet another example, but a very clear example reaching deep decades of history, yet still being relevant to testing rape kits today. And of course, our crime lab and the individuals who are involved in that heavy lift over the last 2.5 years that APD and our administration did to actually clear the rape kit backlog was absolutely informative and helpful to putting together this case for multiple different victims for Paul Apodaca. And so our unit was able to review this and connect the facts and connect these to other cases, and it just shows the importance of testing every kit in a timely way, which of course we are doing now today and going forward at our Albuquerque crime lab. And it's also a credit to what America has done in terms of the CODIS database. So I just want to acknowledge the importance of that in the American criminal justice system, and also because way back in 1995, Paul Apodaca was the first individual that was required to register as a sex offender. Had that not happened in 1995, we may not have been able to bring justice to this case and to the other cases associated with it. So I hope there is some sense of justice today for the victims and for the officers who have never given up on this case. And we continue to fight for victims for every open case, cold or otherwise, in the Albuquerque Police Department. So I want to make sure also everyone knows that there is assistance for victims that is available for domestic violence, for sex crimes. As a reminder, you can always call 924-6028 or email dvc@cabq.gov. That's for domestic violence situations. And also, as a reminder, if there are folks out there associated with cold cases, especially in the event of a sex crime, remember that your testimony, your memories, they still may be absolutely relevant 33 years later. So make sure that you are in touch, at least, that we have the right phone number, that we have the right address, the right contact information for folks who are involved in some of these decades-old cold cases, because you literally never know. You might actually get a call, and that testimony, that small slice of facts that you may have now might actually be used in court to convict and put behind bars someone who should have been decades ago. So with that, Gilbert, we'll hand it over to Deputy Chief Commander. All sorts of titles were thrown around earlier. Deputy Commander Kyle Hartsock, and I also just want to thank him for coming over to APD and for the great work he's done, along with the folks who have been at APD before, and some of our analysts I see in the back for coming back to help out our police department. Deputy Commander.
I'm Deputy Commander Kyle Hartsock. I work in the Criminal Investigations Division, which includes the cold case unit. A couple things I want to just cover quickly before we go into the details. But a homicide case never permanently closes inside the Albuquerque Police Department. And I want to make sure that the most important part of this audience that's watching, and that is the families of other homicide victims who are probably watching this intensely, your case is still open. We're waiting for something else to help it along. The cold case unit has already organized it. These cases are reviewed periodically, and what we're doing now is we're adding even more resources to the cold case unit to make sure that we are looking at the newest technologies and evidence analysis, genetic technology, cell phone and mobile device technology, making sure every witness has been interviewed and re-interviewed again. This process has actually never stopped. One of the things that you're going to see is our new victim advocate manager, Terry Huertas, is working with myself and cold case to start going back, and you should be getting contacted soon to just reconnect a conversation if you don't already have one going, and you might already have one going. That's something we're going to be building. We're going to be building out a part of the website for the police department called Always Remember that will feature every open homicide case the department has. This will take some time to actually build up, but we're starting that project right now so that you'll always have a place to look at your loved one, check in on the case, and communicate with a detective or the department about where your case is at. So that message is really just for the families. We want you to know we'll always remember these cases are always open. As Chief Medina mentioned, the family thought we were there to permanently close it. That just doesn't exist. We don't have a case designation to do that. In diving into this case, working a cold case is tricky. And I want to recognize Detective Gottnerman, Detective Medrano, and Detective Ortiz with our crime lab. They definitely led the way in putting this together, as well as now former Homicide Sergeant Liz Thompson has returned back into civilian role to also help work on this case. This case started back on July 20th when the UNM security officer with UNM and the police department made contact with Paul Apodaca, who just, for no obvious reason, said, I committed some murders and I want to talk to the police about it. As was pointed out, the security officer and the sworn officers did an excellent job and not just blowing these statements off, but taking it very serious. Probably doing a little bit of Google searching and vetting the information has some credibility, and then immediately reached out to our homicide unit so we could go and assist. Things like this can get said to police from time to time, and you never really know how true it is. That's what makes cold cases difficult. In this case, Mr. Apodaca admitted to 3 different murders. The first one was Althea Oakeley. The second one was Kaitlyn Arquette. And the third one, we think we know which case it is. We are talking with the family, the surviving family members of that case about it so they know. But we're not at a point where we want to release the name of that victim, why we do a lot more investigation to actually tie Mr. Apodaca to it. And on that point, that is what a lot of their work was, is going back and saying, do we have unique evidence, insider evidence that Mr. Apodaca is providing that makes his story credible? Is there any more DNA testing we can do? Is there something else, anyone else that he's admitted this to that can put him there? That's the burden that we're going to have to overcome in court. And that's what those detectives have been working on literally nonstop since July 20th. The case involves, sorry if you want to go back to it. As you know from the complaint, Althea was 21 years old. She was walking to her car near what is now the C&M campus when she was just stabbed, apparently random, as you read the original police investigation. A witness that was nearby saw the end of the attack, helped Althea in the last moments and likely scared the perpetrator off, called police. And as a matter of fact, when detectives went back out to the crime scene, found that some of the witnesses actually still live in the area. They're in the same houses as they were 33 years ago. She did pass away, I believe, the next day from her wounds. Go ahead. Paul Apodaca, from the best we can tell and the best you'll be able to find since juvenile age, has been involved in numerous violent crimes and sexual assaults. He has spent he has spent a substantial amount of time in prison in New Mexico for a variety of crimes. As the chief and the mayor mentioned, he was one of the first sex offenders registered in the state of New Mexico. He has committed crimes with firearms, sexual assaults. Most recently, he was arrested on a domestic violence incident with, I believe, his aunt here in Albuquerque, where he barricaded and our tactical unit had to at least start to arrive before he exited the residence and was placed under arrest. So he is no stranger to the New Mexico court system. We only charged one case with the DA's office right now, and that's Ms. Oakley's case, because it was the clearest case that had most of the evidence ready right now. And that's important. When you're talking about prosecuting a 33-year-old case, we have to find all those witnesses. Some might have to testify in court. We have to make sure all the evidence is, you know, in the right places, tested the right way, and the Oakley case was the first one to do it. We anticipate more charges will come on Mr. Apodaca at a future point, but we're working close with the DA's office, and they will ultimately make that decision of if and when those charges come. I can share with you, Mr. Apodaca is slated to, or his case is slated to go in front of a grand jury soon, and he has a detention hearing scheduled this Thursday in district court on the murder charge. Yep, this is a photograph of the sketch that was done by the neighbors back then, and approximately what Mr. Apodaca looked like at the time. Set the number next. One thing we want to put out, again, for the families of other homicide cases that are out there right now, if you want to reach out to the cold case unit, and please, if you have information on a case, you can also call, but we want to give you this number. During normal hours, we will have someone physically at this phone to answer as many of the calls as we can, but also know we're going to be reaching out to you proactively as well. But if you want to talk, catch up on your case, or contact the cold case unit at all, 505-768-4770 is the number that we ask you to try to call. And just as a reminder, again, you know, we're becoming a more victim-centered police department. While there might be a number of these homicide cases that are open, everyone's story, just like Miss Oakley's story, is unique, and we remember that. And we want to solve them all, and we're doing our best to resource it and work these as efficiently as we can. That, I'll go back to the chief.
You know, I just want to talk a little bit about respecting the family's privacy. You know, these are very difficult situations, especially for a family who has endured this for, you know, over 30 years. They've lived with this for 33 years. They thought this case was going to be closed. The first thing that the mother mentioned was the fact that, you know, we have to go through a trial, and the reopening of wounds all these years later. I ask that everybody respect their privacy. When they're ready, if they're ever ready, they will speak on this topic. But we got to remember that a family was left behind. As we sat there and we spoke with her brother wanted her story known. He wanted all aspects of the story known about, you know, and the last time I had seen her brother was actually when he presented this award to me in 1990. And I remember how emotional of a time it was for him then. And it's still 33 years later, very emotional for him. And the one thing he wanted to make sure that everybody remembered about his sister was that this was somebody who didn't get to live their life out. That they died at such a young age that they missed out on their entire life. And he felt that she had such a promising life ahead of her. So I hope that with that, we'll take any questions. Yes, Nancy.
Can you say, was this car at Kaitlyn Arquette's crime scene?
I don't know specific details of the investigation, and we'll wait till that investigation is completed, its charges, before we release information on it.
And I do have to ask this about any other cold cases. Tara Calico, do you think, and I don't know if you can answer this, Kyle, but do you think he's tied to Tara Calico's case? It's around the same time.
You know, that's something that we'll have to look into, investigate. He has admitted to 3, but we can't always say that those are the only 3. Those may just be the first 3 that he's ready to admit to. So I think we're far from being done and completing an investigation and seeing exactly what his impact on this community was.
The other thing I'll mention is the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit out of Quantico has agreed to help us go through Paul Apodaca's history and help us understand a little bit more of who he was and compare that to his prison record, where, you know, where he was at certain times. And if he is involved in other cases, it's something, we're not just stopping at the 3 he's admitted to. We're gonna make sure, does he fit any other patterns?
And Chief, one other question. When you got the chance to tell the family, what was that like for you?
It got emotional for a moment there. I'll be honest, it was a little bittersweet. Like, in a way, you're bringing hopefully closure to a family, but at the same time, you know you're reopening wounds from the past. And I will say that, you know, it was probably one of the most difficult conversations I've had in my career.
And Chief, really quick here
Yes.
too. As far as Arquette goes, do you know the motive behind that from Apodaca at all, or was it just random?
You know, the one thing we have known is he had a dislike, and there was a dislike for women, and that will be coming up in as one of the motivating factors. And can you really truly know exactly why somebody does something so horrible? But he did have a dislike for women.
And again, was it just random, or did he know her at all, or anything like that?
As far as we know, a lot of these cases have been random.
And really quick here too, the Arquette family has, you know, maintained that you know, Apodaca was on the scene that night, and you know, we're curious, why was he never a suspect, or why did police never question him again if he was one of the first ones on the scene or at the scene?
You know, I can't begin to try to answer for detectives 33 years ago, but I hope that we keep in mind that 33 years ago, technology was a whole lot different than it is today. It wasn't as easy to pull police reports. A lot of times back in those days, police reports are handwritten. They were turned into a homicide investigative unit lead, and sometimes those reports stayed there, and it wasn't till way later that they were reviewed. They didn't have a good process back then where we have stuff computerized now where you could look and verify that you hit every single suspect that's in a database. Like now you just hit everybody who comes up on a report that officers talk to. Back then a lot of it was done manually, so I'm not going to begin to try to ask. I'm sure that the officers at the time did the very best job and dedicated their time to try to solve this case. It didn't get solved, and it's just, it'd be unfair for us to criticize without knowing exactly what they were going through at the time.
And lastly here too, have you guys notified the Arquette family, and what was their reaction to the news?
You know, I think Kyle and them have been in communication. I'll let him talk.
The Arquette family's actually been involved since near the beginning. They've been speaking with Detective Gottman and the other detectives about some of these updates. Again, it's hard for us to share a lot of information, even with the family, until the case is charged, even if it's 32, 33 years old, because as we're moving around and wanting to interview people again, we try to not have someone else get to them first. But they definitely are aware of it. They know of the updates. They know that this case is being charged right now first, as well as the third family as well. They're also aware of what's happening.
The two cases are very different, right? Like one was like a stabbing and the other one was a drive-by shooting. Can you talk about any similarities in the MO between the Kaitlyn Arquette case and the Althea Oakeley case?
Again, as Chief pointed out, they both appear to be, the victims were picked at random, or just they were victims of opportunity in terms of no one else was around and they appear to be alone. But this is where the FBI is going to help assist us with maybe answering a little bit. I mean, one was with a knife, one's with a gun. I can tell you the third one's also with a gun. So we want to understand that too. We have the same question that we hope we can get an answer to.
And then the rape case that we mentioned as well, what's going on with that? Will he be charged in that case?
You know, I think that there's still a lot of unanswered questions in terms of finding victims, connecting victims. One of the difficulties we've had is just trying to figure out which cases he's talking about. It's a lot easier on a homicide case, but we're looking that we're having to find ourselves to look for information in our record system from 33 years ago. And you know, during my 26 years, I know 3 different systems we've used during that time, and I think it's going to be he's admitted to these crimes. We have some connections that we're investigating. Obviously, we have to work with the prosecutor's office to see what direction we could go with some of these cases, and it's simply just still the difficulty part of identifying victims and verifying the information he has. But on any of these cases, if the ability to charge is there, regardless of how many other charges he has, serious charges, which may accompany him, may account for him spending the rest of his life in jail, we still will ensure that we charge to ensure that victims and their families get their day of justice.
The case where there's a CODIS hit, has that victim been found? Is she still alive?
I don't have that information. Do you have that, Kyle?
The victim has been contacted, and again, we're in talks with the DA's office on that whole case, basically, from what the statements were then, where the victim's at now, but ultimately the DA's office is doing that review, and they could probably more accurately answer the questions of what the status of that case is. The other two cases, I believe we still aren't able to locate the victims. We believe we probably know what cases he's talking about, but getting people's contact information from decades ago can be tricky, and that means if they even want to cooperate, which they might not want to.
Can you tell us when the CODIS hit was from, what year that rape was?
Yeah, it was in the first half of the 90s, I believe 92 or 93, somewhere in that range.
Do we know how many cold cases there are? Is that something we can quantify?
We can probably figure that out.
We'll get you an answer later. But I think that's one of our commitments. We have already made some changes in cold cases. Just this morning, we gave him a temporary sergeant to start working in the unit. Kyle talked about some of the directions with web pages. You've seen some of the case files of more recent cases that have gone out through our communication group. So we are dedicating resources to this cold case process, and we have a long-term goal of having a fully properly staffed homicide unit, and then transitioning cases into cold case and making sure that they continue to be followed up on, and that we have the resources to look at them periodically. So we are making those changes, and we'll be making further announcements on some of those changes in the near future. And they actually started prior to a lot of this, as we know those case files that have been coming out for a period of time.
My last question is just, the Kaitlyn Arquette case is obviously very high profile. I've been reading a lot of the articles. There was theories about the Vietnamese mafia. There was, I think, 2 suspects were actually arrested, but the case was dismissed. Can you talk about kind of the long journey this case has taken over the past several years?
It is a long journey, and a lot of these cases are a long journey, and I think it's important that we remember that that's a prime example of another family who has been looking for answers for 32 years. And hopefully we could provide some of these questions to these these families, but it's extremely difficult to solve a homicide, especially when it's a random homicide and the individual slips into the night and nobody sees them. A lot of homicide investigation that's interviewing people and getting them to admit that they're willing to say who done it. But in some of these cases with such randomness and an individual acting alone, you don't have that, informant, as so to speak, that is going to give you the information to help you break the case. So I think that there's a level of frustration from families out there, and a lot of times through that frustration, it makes for a long journey, and they've done what they could to try to move this case forward and bring some answers for themselves. So I think hopefully this will help the family with that.
Was there any kind of reaction within the police department when he confessed to it that he was actually at the scene, that he, rather than it being the Vietnamese mafia or something else, there was someone who was actually there that night?
Kyle?
Yeah, I can't put myself in the shoes of the cold case detectives, but as I got debriefed on these talks, I mean, lots of light bulbs were firing off in rapid succession as they took a statement, but then started digging into reports. A lot of things started to connect in the exact way he was saying it, and again, that goes to the credibility of what his statement was, which is the hardest thing to verify. So, yes.
Kyle, how fortunate do you all feel like you have some detectives, if Liz is coming back, you have some detectives who've been with this department for 30, 40 years.
Yes, I mean, we got lucky, and it was good planning between Detective Gotterman, Medrano, and even Detective Ortiz with criminalistics, and former Sergeant Thompson. They have decades of experience, and you have to kind of slow roll these cases initially. You have to be very methodical as you review police reports that were 3 or 4 systems old, right, with different lab processes, different evidence tagging processes, cops that have been retired since a year after the case happened.
They were set up really well. We gave them the time and the space to do it at the way they wanted to do it, and it's turning out as a high quality product so far.
You know, and I think it's important we recognize that there's been great officers working on this case for 33 years. I think it's easy for people to feel like something was missed 33 years ago, but nobody purposely, no officer, detective purposely missed anything 33 years ago. For 33 years, people have worked on this case on and off. You have the original batch of detectives. You mentioned about detective experience, and I could tell you, Nancy, one of the detectives you know, Rich Lewis, was one of the individuals I reached out to in 13 and in the past to kind of take a look to see if there's anything else to do on this case. So there's been a great history of detectives and personnel from the Albuquerque Police Department who worked on this case over the past 33 years, and we're hoping that we could continue to work on several other cases to see if we can't bring some kind of closing and resolution to those cases for the families.
Why do you think you confess now?
You know, I think there's a lot of times we can't say why somebody did something. You know, it's unknown. You know, whether they had remorse over what they did 30 years ago and somebody caught them at the right time in the right place. And sometimes that's what it takes. You look at a lot of our individuals, when we take them into custody, and especially when we have people with substance abuse problems, right there and then they're ready to change their life because they're going back into custody. And that's why I compliment the University of New Mexico Police Department, the security officer, because a lot of times when that individual gets booked and they kind of get those jailhouse lawyers around them, they clam up and they don't talk anymore. And they've lost that moment of clarity, as I call it, in the backseat of that police car. So we got it at the right time. He wanted to talk about the crimes he had committed, and gratefully we had some personnel on the ground dealing with him that saw the urgency of getting this information out, and people started talking and communicating with him along with them.
Chief, the officers from UNM who also questioned him, they're retired APD, aren't they?
Yes, some of them are retired APD, so in a way you could say APD's been involved in this case in a lot of aspects throughout the passage of time.
Any other questions? No? Thank you very much.